All right, I guess let's get started. Hi, my name is Amit Gode. I'm filling in for Sarah here. So welcome to the Academy Enrichment series. And today we are going to discuss a 1572 form. And we have two experts with a lot of experience here today to discuss it with us. We want this to be not didactic in the sense we want nice free flowing questions and comments, and not only questions, but we'd also like to hear your experiences. That's always valuable, and I think it brings a lot to the table. So please join me in welcoming Cynthia Dwight and Mark Casati, both from the Cancer Center CTO, and please take it over.
All right, thank you. So we will get started with the objectives. First, to understand the purpose of the FDA Form 1572. Second, we'll go through all the individual sections, and then we will summarize and conclude with identifying common questions and pitfalls, giving you tips and tricks for working with the Form 1572. So first of all, the FDA Form 1572, what, when, and why is it? It is an agreement by the investigator to provide the information to the sponsor and ensure that they will comply with the FDA regulations related to conduct of clinical investigation. So it is a legally binding contract, more or less, between the investigator and the sponsor, or the sponsor and the FDA, excuse me. And when is it used? If the clinical investigation is being conducted under an investigational new drug application or an IND. So if the trial is IND exempt, or if it is using an investigational device, or if it's any other research that doesn't have an IND, the 1572 form is not required. And it must be completed and signed prior to the initiation of the participation in the trial. So the why. The why is to provide the sponsor with the information about the investigator's qualifications and the clinical site. And it is determining if the investigator and the site are appropriate to conduct the trial. And furthermore, it's to inform the investigator of his or her responsibilities and obligations, and to obtain the investigator's commitment to follow the pertinent FDA regulations. So starting with section 1, which is name and investigator, name and address of the investigator sign. The name that should put in should be the full legal name. So make sure that you know that for sure. If in doubt, ask and get it correct, including correct spelling. Sometimes some of the doctors will use a first initial or maybe a nickname, but always use that legal name since it is more or less a legally binding contract. And for the address, use the work address where the investigator can be reached by mail or in person. This is usually their office address up there where they're located. And what about co-investigators? Co-investigators is not a term that is used and defined by FDA regulations, although some study teams and some sponsors might use that. It is commonly used, so if you determine the need of a co-investigator, and if they're fully responsible for fulfilling all the investigations, or for a sub-investigator, you may use those. A co-investigator, for those who might not be familiar, it would share the responsibilities between two individuals, whereas the FDA regulations describe a principal investigator, to which all the responsibilities are held, and the sub-investigators for the regulations are just their colleagues, but they don't hold as many responsibilities. If it is a true co-investigator, then you'll need a separate 1572 to be completed and signed. Basically, you'll have duplicate agreements between that sponsor and the FDA. Moving towards section number 2, the education, training, and experience that qualify the investigator as an expert in the clinical investigation. This requirement is to attach a CV or other statement of qualification. And it should show the PI's education, their training, their experience that qualifies them as an expert in the clinical investigation of the drug, biologic for use in their investigation. If you're studying something that is a cardiac study, they should have appropriate experience in cardiac research or cardiac drugs. Likewise, if it's another, maybe a pediatric study, they should have equal experience in that pediatric population shown in their CV. Section number 3 is the name and address of any medical school, hospital, or other research facility where the clinical investigation will be conducted. And this should include the address or addresses of the location or locations where the investigation will be conducted and where the test article will be shipped if it's different than the investigator's address record. As a note, with our campuses, with Frederick Medical College, Children's University, other entities all on one campus, sometimes there is sometimes the physician or the principal investigator might their office address might be medical college, but then it might use the clinical the Frederick Hospital clinical spaces, for instance. Those would be, you'd want to make sure that it would be that Frederick Hospital clinical address. If the location is at multiple institutions for the research, if you might use community sites, community clinics or hospitals, even any other sites where the research could be conducted, then they should be added as multiple locations to this section. However, if there's interaction with subjects that is not related to the research trial, for instance, if there might be an interaction or some clinical visits that is outside of the scope of the trial that might be seen for normal clinical care at a different institution, that address would not be added. It's just putting the boundary around where are the activities in this research trial being conducted.
Can I ask a question? What about if your study supplies are stored at another location? Does that go in here?
Yes. Yes, it would. Mm-hmm. And conversely to that, if the test article and supply is, for instance, a trial at Frederick Hospital where the research is being conducted and it's held by Frederick Investigational Drug Services, because that is the same 9200 West Wisconsin, and it's within Frederick Hospital, but just maybe a different department.
Yeah.
It isn't necessary to include that duplicate address. Yeah, good question. Section 4 is the name and the address of the clinical laboratory facilities to be used in the study. So it's intended to identify clinical laboratories or test facilities directly contributing to or supporting the clinical study. So things like diagnostic labs performing blood work, imaging centers, cardiology labs, etc. And it may include analytical labs that provide pharmacokinetic analysis, and laboratories supplying efficacy data for clinical investigations conducted under an IND. And oftentimes, if it's a multi-center trial with conducted by a pharmaceutical sponsor, they might have their own central labs, which we are not associated with. We don't know at all where those are. In that case, sponsor would have to provide those addresses and those locations in a template. And likewise with some of the other diagnostic labs, if you're partnering in a study on campus here, partnering with a research lab in the medical college, for instance, that's doing basic science research, that would be a good example of one of these additional research labs put in section 4 here.
just as a reminder for section 4, they want the address of where the testing is resulted. So if it is drawn at a center, you know, maybe a office or some of our community sites, a majority of those samples are resulted at our main WDL location. So you don't need where it's drawn, where the sample is collected necessarily for this portion of the 1572. You want the where it's resulted.
Yes, good point. The next section is section number 5, the name and the address of the institutional review board responsible for review and approval of the study. And so this shown here is the address for if it's using local IRB, MCW Freighter Institutional Review Board. If it is a central laboratory, central IRB, maybe a commercial IRB, or if it's relying on coordinated institution as the single IRB for a study, you should actually use both institutional review boards. Just that MCW Freighter Hospital IRB, as well as that other central IRB or other coordinated institutions IRB. And the reason for that is because with the reliance process, even though that external IRB might be the IRB of record, reviewing all protocol changes and continuing reviews and so forth, MCW IRB also oversees the local context. So some of the things like training documentation annually, including sitting training, and also if there's UPERSOs, MCW IRB, even though they are not the IRB of record, requires us to report those to them. So there's you would have to put both of those addresses in these boxes.
Now for everyone's favorite section, section 6, which is otherwise known as the names of the sub-investigators. I think everyone's probably very, very aware of this section. And the purpose is to capture the information about those people who are part of the investigative team, who are going to assist the principal investigator and who make a direct and significant contribution to the data. Okay, the decision here really depends on their level of responsibility and whether or not they're performing significant clinical investigation related duties. The regulation states that in the event an investigation is conducted by a team of individuals, the investigator is the responsible leader of the team. Sub-investigators include any other individual member of that team. And it requires in 21 CFR 312.53C18 requires the investigator to provide a list of the names of the sub-investigators who will be assisting the investigator in the conduct of the investigations. So basically we're looking at is there someone who is directly involved in the performance of the procedures required by the protocol and the collection of data, then that person should be on the 1572. You know, if the protocol states that each subject needs to visit a specified internist who will perform, you know, full physicals to qualify subjects, then that internist needs to be included on section 6, even though they may not be doing anything that is outside of their normal scope of their practice, because they are because they're specified in the protocol, because that physical is what qualifies them to be enrolled in the study. That is why. So you kind of have to think about the roles and what they're doing. A common question is, should research nurses or staff nurses or residents or fellows, office staff, who else should be in section 6? And this is what the FDA guidance says. Basically, if they're providing ancillary or intermittent care, but who do not make a direct and significant contribution to the data, then they do not need to be listed individually. So the clinic nurse who rooms a patient and takes their vitals don't need to be included in section 6. Generally speaking, a residents and fellows are not necessarily working independently on studies. The caveat to residents and fellows are if they are doing anything that is directly impactful to the study. So this is where it can get a little bit tricky. Obviously, if they are consenting patients, then they need to be listed in section 6. If they're analyzing the data, which happens quite frequently sometimes on IITs, they would be making a direct contribution to the study. They would need to be listed in section 6. If they are performing any type of procedure or anything that is related maybe to one of the outcome measures of the study, and that they would not normally be doing otherwise or on every patient, then they need to be listed. So you really have to kind of think about what is the role in the research and how they are impacted. The emergency physician who happens to see a patient because in the ED because they have a AE and they go there on Saturday, they don't need to be in section 6. Here is the guidance document. I would suggest finding this document. If you search 1572 FDA guidance document, it will pop up. It has been around for a very long time. And I have frequently quoted this to industry sponsors when they're like, no, you need to put these people on. I say, oh, no. Please go to page 13 of this guidance document. It's the bottom of the page. And it'll tell you why they don't need to be involved.
There's a question on the chat. What if a coordinator administers a questionnaire? I have heard departments adding coordinators if they administer the questionnaires or perform study EKGs.
Yes, welcome to our next topic. So, the question is often, should pharmacists or research coordinators be listed? And some of that is, well, it depends. And it's dependent upon the contribution that the individual makes to the study. Basically, pharmacists, generally only if they make a direct and significant contribution to the data for a specific study, is the requirement and the guidance from the FDA. Research coordinators generally have a greater role in performing clinical study functions, and they tend to make more of a direct and significant contribution to the data. They often recruit subjects, consent subjects, collect and evaluate study data, and maintain records. Therefore, and this is coming directly from the guidance document from the FDA, the research coordinator should usually be listed in section 6 of the 1572. So did that answer their questions?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's, if they're interacting with the subject, if they're performing surveys, those types of things, asking questions directly related to the study, then according to the FDA, they should be on the 1572. There are a few departments I know around campus who don't agree with the FDA. I'm just going to say that.
Do you think that's because of how many times they would have to change the 1572 because of CRC turnover?
It could be, but we'll get to that in a minute.
I'll zip it then.
So, another common question is, do sub-investigators, so people were still on box 6, do they need to attach a CV? And the answer from the FDA is no. You do not need to attach the sub-investigator's CV when submitting it to the FDA. Now, that does not mean that you're not going to have sponsors that ask, but technically, according to the 1572, the principal investigator who signs the 1572 is responsible of ensuring any sub-investigators have the appropriate training and education to provide the duties that they are delegated. So again, you can whip out this handy dandy document when people want, you know, additional CVs. However, those people listed in box 6 do have to report out any financial interests. So there you go. I think we all have to sign financial disclosure statements with the university. Please reach out to corporate compliance and they will work with you to get the declaration and mitigation plan. And also what would need to be included in your informed consent statement if someone does have a financial interest that needs to be reported. Now we get into some of the things that are generally, you may not know for an IND or a IIT that you're doing here. It's the name and code number of the protocols for the IND to be conducted. And basically they want the name of the protocol, the name on the code number listed on the IND. So if you have if a investigator holds an IND, then, and they have multiple protocols that they are doing under that IND, then you would need to list all of those protocols on the 1572. And then section 8, you're supposed to attach the full protocol. For phase 1 studies, you can utilize an outline. And so I think those are kind of pretty self-explanatory. This is copied and pasted out of the signature page of the 1572. And these are all of the things that the PI agrees to when they sign it. You will note that it lists a lot of parts from the common federal rules. And I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that most investigators that sign a 1572 have no idea what maintaining adequate and accurate records in accordance with 21 CFR Part 312.62 states. But they are signing a document that holds up in court if they ever get in trouble. So they may or may not want to look at it. But this is what they are agreeing to. As you all know, it is the PI's responsibility to oversee the entire trial. And this is basically where it lays out all of those requirements.
I think this is really an important, I mean, this is the whole purpose of the form, especially for junior investigators to read this and understand that it's not, you can't just say, oh, well, but that part was done by the pharmacist, or this part was done by the coordinator. That has no meaning.
Exactly.
You are ultimately responsible for every activity, every adverse event, everything that happens within your trial.
And you're responsible to ensure that the people who are working as sub-investigators and are involved in the trial have the appropriate education, training, and knowledge to do those things.
Right.
And I think those are the two pieces that are often missed and they miss in the understanding.
One of the excuses they give for FDA audits. I didn't do that. My coordinator was doing it.
Well, coincidentally, in the Cancer Center, we have an FDA audit going on right now.
Yes, we do.
Oh, fun.
And I was privileged to be in the opening meeting, and it was questions directly to the principal investigator about describe the study, describe your policy and how you did informed consent. And it didn't, they didn't reach out to the clinical research coordinator who might have documented that and might have potentially, given the principal investigator, if the principal investigator obtained the informed consent. Didn't ask the clinical research coordinator name that. The PI was ultimately responsible. So
also, the audit going on is not for cause audit.
Correct.
Routine.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
we wouldn't be sitting here if there was a board audit going on. This would have been rescheduled. We had a couple of additional things to note, and this kind of gets back to Shar's question. How often is it required to update the 1572? The only requirement is to update the 1572 when investigators are added. And then generally at the end of the study. If the principal investigator is also the sponsor, the 1572 updates need to be submitted annually or with other updates to the IND. So I think to your question about, because of coordinator turnover, are people not putting coordinators on the 1572 because it takes extra work? I think that was the reason given in the past.
Yeah.
But that's not what the guidance says. So, and I will say at other institutions where coordinators have not been added to the 1572, it has been a finding in audits. And so, you can take that as you will. A couple other tips. The 1572 does not expire. So if the OMB date changes, date up in the corner, if that changes, it doesn't mean you have to do a new 1572. Now, if it's a brand new study, a brand new IND, you need to use the most current and up-to-date form. But if you have a valid 1572 that was done, signed prior to that OMB date changing, as long as there are no other changes to the investigators, you don't have to do a new one just because the form, quote unquote, the actual form expires. Other updates to the 1572 other than sub-investigators or a PI change only need to be done at the end, which includes but is not limited to a sub-investigator leaving. And any additional locations in section 3 and 4, and those are your laboratory sections and other places that they're done. So you can create a log list of additional laboratories that are utilized, additional imaging facilities that may be utilized, some of those other types of things, locations in 3 and 4. You don't have to do a brand new 1572 every single time an additional location is added or taken off. And the other thing that I know we often do is we have a blanket note to file explaining the differences between the 1572 and CV addresses, because it's just not worth trying to get those to align.
Yeah. On that point, I think there's some confusion among sponsors with an investigator, their office address being on their CV versus the location of the research might be a different place, because we have that dual Frederick and Medical College of Wisconsin. Also, we have note files that we use because our institution likes calling itself various different things, versus Frederick Hospital in one place, Medical College in the other place, the Frederick ampersand MCW in other places on some documents. So we almost have like it's 10 or 15 different iterations of what they might be called on RP letters versus one investigator's CV versus their license. And it just helps make it a lot more streamlined instead of having to make kind of one-off note files for when sponsors find them, because some doctor that's new to the institution might not have known the correct terminology to use, for instance. So.
And I do apologize if I missed this, but what do you put for the address? Because normally I would put like the medical college first, and then where it's being done at Frederick. Is that how you would recommend it being done, or?
You want to, most places, you will want to do that, because you want to have the other thing to remember is that your location also needs to include the Medical College of Wisconsin, because that's who is contractually agreeing to do these things, and then Freighter as the clinical location. We have a few instances where the address is the same for the investigator because they happen to have their office locations in Freighter buildings.
Mhm.
But I think in general, those get separated and called out across the board. And this is one of my favorite tips that is also included in that guidance document that the link was in there for. The FDA does not require CVs to be signed or dated. So when you get your sponsors calling you and saying these CVs are out of date, they're more than 2 years since they signed and dated them, I'm like, here you go.
Yeah.
They don't need to be signed or dated per the FDA guidance. That
You
is
have a link
your,
to that in the slides.
yes,
Okay.
that is your rule that you created. There are a few things, and I will say there is language in ICH GCP R2 that does allude to CVs need to be, I think their wording is something like current. So a lot of sponsors, a lot of our industry, pharmaceutical industry sponsored studies do require that sites adhere to the ICH GCP regulations. So that's where they tend to get that from. I think we've been pretty successful in the cancer center by having a policy that says that, CVs will be signed and dated, but they will only be updated with significant changes, when significant changes need to be made. And I can't remember, is there a specific time frame? Like they can't be more than a certain number of years old.
We don't define a certain.
We didn't
time
define
frame.
it. We just said
Spon-
significant.
Sponsors seem to think that every 2 years is a good time for requesting them, but to think about it practically, I mean, Dr. X, who has, is fully qualified at the initiation of the study, just because his CV is 2 years and 1 day old, it doesn't mean that overnight he or she lost all of that qualification and experience. I mean, they're still fully qualified.
I think we tend to request them if they have, title changes. They go difference between assistant or associate or full.
Mhm.
If they have some major publication, seminal publication, the investigators that have the 40-page CV, no one's going to look and see if every single publication has been added onto it. Those types of things, they're not so worried about when things change. The other time that we'll ask is if they have been affiliated with something else. So if they have additional new affiliations, we have a few investigators who are affiliated with multiple institutions. If they have new institutional affiliations, those are the types of things that sponsors and the FDA want to know about. Usually that's more related to just disclosures as far as confidential disclosures, but those are things that we want to let them know about as well.
And on the I guess the date that the CV was written, if you see one that, even though there isn't technically an expiration date, if you see one that's several years old, then you might ask the investigator, do you have, they will often keep their CV up to date, if they're submitting to any grant or, application process or anything like that, a lot of that process, they have to submit a current CV to show that they are qualified for requesting that grant. So they often have them, updated once or twice a year, not, even when they do talks and things like that. So you might ask them if they have a current version, but for the regulations, they can't be required to update it.
But for grants, don't they just submit an abbreviated CV?
They do.
Yeah.
Yeah, they usually do.
Well,
Yeah.
for a grant, you usually have a biosketch.
A bio
Right,
sketch, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So generally, other things that we kind of wanted to make sure everybody, generally, if someone is listed on the 1572, either in box 1 or box 6, they really should be on the DOA. However, not everyone on the DOA needs to be listed on the 1572. It goes back to that trying to determine whether or not they are making a significant and direct contribution to the study data and outcomes. So a lot of times we will have people listed on our DOA lab staff. We have a specific cancer center research lab. They do all of our processing and shipping for, study specific labs. They're generally on the DOAs, but they're not going on the 1572 of every single study because their job is to do those things. So it kind of falls under that usual and customary language that people like to use. Sorry.
That's a great example, though. So if you say, like a TRU kind of a setup, where you have rotating nurses who will care for this patient for research purposes, not clinical.
Yep. Mhm.
Do all the nurses go on it?
On
The
DOA.
On the
DOA or
DOA.
1572?
They usually don't go on the 1572s
Okay.
because it's just they are
Part.
following, either orders, right, or from the investigators, or it's part of their usual and customary role.
Mhm.
It depends on the study what we're asking them to do, right? I've been involved in studies that utilize TRUs where the true nurses need to be certified in providing a certain, assessment that is an outcome measure of the study. In that case, they would be on the DOA, but they may not be put on the 1572.
Mhm.
So those are kind of, it's not as cut and dry sometimes as you want it to be. But that, so you kind of have to think about those things. Yeah, but I would say if they're in box 1 or 6 of the 1572, definitely make sure they're on the DOA somewhere.
This is like floor nurses who are just giving patient the medication. They don't need to
They
be on
don't
the
need to
DOA.
be on the DOA. No. Or the 1572, luckily.
But not all sponsors know that.
But not all sponsors know that. Again, I believe it's page 13
Okay.
of the FDA guidance document. It's either page 15 or question 13. I can't remember. This is kind of a reminder that WDL is listed as a laboratory site, and the laboratory site is where samples are processed and resulted, not collected. And what else? And you might get requests. We get these all the time from industry sponsors for additional like they want specified out locations. The location of, well, what's the drug shipment location? That's one that we get all the time. What's the, they want the specific room number and location on there for our research lab, where they get, like, literally the tubes get shipped out of. Sometimes they ask, I've seen people ask for, well, what's the exact room location on your campus for your clinical trials office? Again, those aren't required. I think a lot of times industry sponsors utilize the 1572 just to collect information about a site because it's in an easy place to do it.
Mhm.
And they have systems that are set up to scrape those documents to put them in their own record, to move them over to the main 1572 that the sponsor has to give to the FDA. So just remember that really the 1572 is a document that's technically between the sponsor, the IND holder, and the FDA. It's not a document between, if we're in an industry sponsored trial, it's an agreement with us to be added to their main 1572. And so but I think it gets utilized a lot by industry sponsors as a collection source.
One last thing that was kind of one of the earlier tips was that OMB date, that expiration date of the actual form. And I think the current one, it's, I believe, March 31st of 2025. It's every 3 years. I believe the last one was in 2022. And if you're an industry sponsored study, the industry sponsor might very well provide a new updated template. Otherwise, I think this last time it was about 6 or 8 months later on the FDA website, they posted it. If you just Google FDA form 1572, you can find all the FDA templates, but also the 1572 one. And that'll be critical. It's an IIT in which you are the sponsor and you wouldn't have a pre-filled one to fill out.
Yep.
But with that 6 to 8 month kind of delay between when the last one expired technically and when the new one is released, we did in the Cancer Center actually reach out to FDA, and in that gap, the previous ones were allowed because they didn't have a new one.
That's all we had.
Does anyone want to share their experiences or anecdotal incidences about this in their routine, online or in person? So
We
it'll be
answered all the
interesting.
questions.
But it'll be interesting with FDA, not FDA, but more NIH pushing for decentralized clinical trials.
Mhm.
Where on the, the address of the location.
So they have some guidance. They
Yeah,
have
there
draft
is some.
guidance out.
So what
They
does
do,
that say?
so they have some draft guidance. So we didn't really go into that because it's still draft guidance. It's not finalized. It basically falls in line with the general guidance related to locations. You don't have to include patient homes though, right? If you have a decentralized trial and you have people that are going to participants' homes to see them. But they are still insisting of the collection of the lab addresses, of imaging sites, of healthcare providers so they want you to basically kind of create a log of healthcare providers that may perform visits, procedures, whatever that they would normally do, kind of as their usual and customary jobs, but that you would utilize the data for in studies. So you need to create a listing of those people. You don't have to, but they don't need to go on the 1572. I don't think the form is significantly going to change. It doesn't look like. Basically they're asking for, I think of it almost as like an addendum page, where you would list the providers that might be utilized. You can utilize a log, which is what, technically you can do now if you have new lab facilities or those things that are utilized during the performance of a trial. Because you don't have, but they specifically said you do not have to update the 1572 immediately. It still will only require being updated with the addition of investigators or a change of a principal investigator.
And is this an example, for example, of a home health service?
Yeah, so the home health service though would need to be listed as a, it's box 2, 3, in the one that's the location where things would be provided. 2, 3 is labs, so it's 2, sorry. In box 2 is generally where you would list the home health care provider.
Okay.
Like, and you'd list the office, the company, right? Their company. Right. Because again, think of it sort of like listing, when we list MCW, generally you'd list MCW because that's where the clinical research office is, quote unquote, right? You don't list like what room your coordinators live in. but that's kind of what that listing is for. It's the same thing for the home health office location. It's kind of it because that's really where they are licensed out of.
Okay, but you
and
wouldn't need to
regulated
change
out.
the 1572 if they were added.
You would not, you would only if the only time, so you need to add them in. So generally at the end of a study, you have to submit a final 1572 that has all of the locations on it. You don't need to submit a new 1572 to the FDA immediately when you add those in. If there are, but generally the sponsor wants an update at least annually so that they can include them in their annual updates to the FDA when they're updating about their IND. So if it is a, but if it's an addition of a home health agency, you're now going to provide services related to the study, you're going to utilize this home health agency, that is a new amendment to your protocol, and that would be considered a major change with the IND. You're going to have to submit that to the FDA for, to give them their time to say yes or no. So if it's an IIT here and your investigator is the sponsor, they're going to ask for that in my experience. So you're going to add them. You're going to have to know who that is before you do that change anyway. So you just add them in.
And then as far as when you print it for the investigator to sign, I've always followed the rule, and it might not even be a rule, that it has to be printed two-sided, that you can't have like 4 separate one-sided sheets.
That's not a rule.
Okay. It's just a rule that I made up.
It's a rule that somebody made up at some point in time. Because I mean, I've had 1572s that end up being like 15 pages long.
Yeah.
Because you just have so many locations and are doing so many things. Also remember that as they can be electronically signed as long as the electronic signatures can be validated. So, generally through like Florence, they can sign them. Certain Adobe products, that signature is allowed. DocuSign, generally if it's Part 11 compliant, DocuSign is allowed. They have to, your electronic signature has to follow the common rule around electronic signatures.
A note with the electronic signatures in the cancer center, we utilize Florence now for all of these, and that signature spot on the 1572 form has a separate spot for signature and a separate box for date. And if they are signing electronically, if you've seen in Florence, it's just that one stamp which has the name and the date and time stamp in it. So you might think, well, I don't need the date box, but actually the FDA has confirmed because the box is there,
It has to be filled in.
yeah.
Okay.
So we prepare the form and make that like a required box that they can't sign without actually filling in. They might still mess up the date format. So you have to rewrite it, but at least they put something in that box.
Right.
I think 1572s were, I remember this thing. Printed front and back and have 2 original copies, one you keep on side, the other the sponsors take. So no, not true.
That's a sponsor rule.
Mm.
It's not an FDA rule.
Okay.
Oh,
knew
I
I
mean,
heard it
and it
somewhere.
may have been a rule. I mean, I remember doing that. I remember being told we had to do that. It very well could have been an FDA rule back in the day. But really the FDA now actually prefers electronic documents. And so, I think probably back in the day when everything was paper, right? When we were doing these things, it was that way just because they were trying to decrease the paper utilization and how much they had to cart back with them. But now I think they really are, almost all federal agencies are preferring electronic, things. So I would say if you can do it that way, it's generally a lot easier. Yeah, I remember we had a study once and it was literally almost half of a box truck of, you know, those banker boxes that you would send out that, we had to send off somewhere. So,
I remember 15 packs of the study and everything for each member of the IRB.
Yep.
Yeah,
mhm.
couldn't say like just pack up 15 of them. You had 15 stacks like this. Back in the day.
Back in the days, right? Know if there were any other questions. I don't see the chat.
No, I
in
don't,
mine. Okay.
don't see any other questions. Okay, all right, I think we can wrap this up. So thank you everyone so much, and thank you both of you for coming over. You're most welcome to come and present other topics.
Oh, I
And-
know history for all of
Good.
it. What else do you know? What else do you?
And we actually also want to hear more topics what the audience wants to hear from us. So either shoot us an email or put it in the chat. Anything else you guys want to hear, and we'll find the speakers and, you know, keep this going.
Some of the topics we have coming up, preparing for an FDA audit, effect, exception from informed consent when that is appropriate. We also have basically the organizations and certifications that research staff can get. So we have, those are topics that are coming up, but we're always looking for more.
So I think they're for next year, because I believe this is
Right.
the last one for this year. So happy holidays to everyone. We'll see you next year.
Thanks.
Thank you.